Good afternoon if you're in Europe, good morning if you're on the East Coast, and good evening if you are in Asia. And welcome to this webinar organized by the Observatory of Populism that Mark Lazar and myself have created 2 years ago. We are very fortunate today to benefit from the expertise of two specialists of politics in America. Cas Mudde and Gérard Araud will explore for us the question we have asked them: Midterms 2022, foreshadowing the comeback of the far-right challenge in the US for 2024, ? I will briefly introduce our guests today before leaving them the floor. Cas Mudde is Professor of International Affairs at the University of Georgia, as well as Professor at the University of Oslo in Norway, and is a world-renowned scholar of far-right and populist politics, focusing specifically on party politics in Europe and North America. His very famous book, Populist Radical Right Parties in Europe, published by Cambridge University Press in 2007, won the Steinrock Prize for Comparative Social Science Research in 2008. And his recent book, Populism, A Very Short Introduction, co-authored with Cristobal Rovira Caldwasser, has been translated into 20 languages, including French. Gérard Araud is a career diplomat. He has retired from the French Foreign Service as Ambassador of France to the United States in 2019 after 5 years in this position. And he previously held numerous positions within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of France, notably Director for Strategic Affairs, Security and Disarmament, Ambassador of France to Israel, Director General for Political Affairs and Security, and Permanent Representative of France to the UN in New York between 2009 and 2014. Both of them will open the session with remarks of roughly 15 minutes each. And Cas will start for deciphering for us the results of the midterm elections, which have just been completed or almost completed. We'll return to that. This is something he will certainly analyze from the point of view of populism in the US, one of his specialties. And the questions, of course, will rally around the question of the fate of Trumpism in these midterm elections. And then Gérard Araud will return to politics for sure, but in a larger perspective, analyzing in particular the implications of the political landscape, American political landscape for US foreign policy, and the implications for us in Europe in particular. So this is a very promising and exciting topic and agenda. I'm sure the participants will have many questions. I invite them immediately to ask their questions in the chat box and to use this box also for making comments or exchanging views, suggesting readings, whatever. But I will read the questions from this box once the two speakers will have completed their presentations. And I hand over the floor immediately to Cas for the first of these two presentations. Cas, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Christophe. Thanks for the invitation. So it's important to start out by saying that not all the votes have been counted. And at this point in time, it's still unclear who will control the House. And it won't be clear almost certainly for another few weeks who controls the Senate. And so there are a few things clear. And overall, I think a lot of people went through all kind of different emotions. There had been a red wave predicted, and confusingly in the US, red refers to the right, the Republicans, and blue refers to the left or center Democratic Party. And so a red wave had been predicted, which was, I think, to a large extent because some very partisan right-wing groups were flooding the polls with highly partisan polls, and aggregate pollers just included them, although they knew that they were part of a political propaganda. And to a certain extent, the media, including the liberal media, for some reason really had an interest in arguing that the Democrats were going to lose. So it looks now that despite the fact that the Democrats feel really good about the midterms, and it was in historical perspective one of the smallest losses of an incumbent party, and incumbent means that you have the presidency. The Republicans are going to control the House, and to a certain extent with today's party discipline, it doesn't matter whether you control it with a majority of 1 or 75. You're going to control it, and the House will be in the next 2 years very disruptive. I would expect that the Senate is going to be decided in the runoff here in Georgia, where I live. And I think that Warnock is again going to pull it off, which would mean that the Senate remains in the hands of the Democrats, which is quite relevant because it makes it harder, for example, to impeach the president and just be disruptive all over the place. This is not so much about the Democrats doing well. I think more than anything, the Republicans really messed it up. And they messed it up on the basis of 2 things, and both go to the same thing. They were too extremist. On the one hand, it was a backfire to the Supreme Court decision to gut Roe v. Wade, and by and large, no longer federally protect abortion, which means that abortion is now a state competency. And already about half of all states in the US have completely banned abortion. And so what we see is there's been a lot of voting from women, and there's been a lot of voting from younger people, and particularly young women. And for them, abortion was a key issue. The other important point was Trump. Trump had pushed some either handpicked or really out there candidates that he had pushed through the primary, and they won the primary, but they did poorly in the regular election. Now, poorly has to be qualified, though. It generally means that these type of outsider Trump candidates were about 3-4% behind, which if you look at their competence and their ideas is disturbingly little. Many of these people have never served, have said the craziest things, even by US standards today, and only pay the price of like 3-4%. But because most elections in the US are so tight, it has meant that they lost them or they've made them far too close. So I'm going to focus on 4 quick points. Let me start with the most positive thing, which is a bit underplayed. Since 2020 presidential elections, and particularly since the insurrection of January 6th, there has been a really extremist shift within the Republican Party, which more and more people denying the legitimacy of the 2020 election. In fact, of all the Republican candidates running in the midterms, only 1/3 of the candidates to some extent accepted that the 2020 election results were legitimate. Oddly enough, despite the fact that the Republican Party heavily underperformed and the right wing is shocked by this, there has been very little talk about a stolen election or the idea that these elections weren't legitimate. And that is very significant. Of course, it also shows that for most Republicans, they were just saying this without believing it, which is highly problematic, and we can talk about that more. Populism. So populism did feature. Pretty much the Republican Party had 2 main topics. One was economic, which was around inflation mostly. And much of the inflation discourse was about the coastal elites not understanding like the plight of the hardworking American. And so it's a classic kind of socioeconomic populist discourse, which here in the US has an incredibly long tradition and wasn't that remarkable in many races, inflation was one of the key issues, but it wasn't the most emotional issue. The Republican Party today is pretty much all about the fight against so-called woke. And woke stands for anything to the left of the Republican Party. It is a weird combination of populist arguments, of nativist arguments, of classic conservative arguments, religious arguments. The idea is that there is a shadowy elite that tries to change the real America in line with Marxism, cultural Marxism, whatever it is. And it particularly focused on issues like LGBTQ rights in the US, but also race in a more subtle way. And so that was very much what the campaign was about. Pretty much everywhere this wokeness played a major role, as did inflation. And it had a populist discourse, but I would say that the populism wasn't particularly strong. It was as strong as it usually is. Now, the big story, because he has been the big story since 2015, is Donald Trump. And there is a strong, just an across-the-board consensus from the liberal media to the conservative media that Trump is the big loser of this election. And what Trump kind of did is what the Tea Party did in the early 2010s. And that is, Trump has this momentum within the base that votes in primaries. And that means that the primaries, which they're organized very differently, everything in the US is done at the state or even county level in elections. But it generally, the primaries means that people who identify with one party will come out and vote which candidates they want to represent them in the election. Now, the electorate of the primaries is small and very specific. It tends to be more radical than the broader electorate. And so Trump holds particular sway among the primary electorate, and he has pushed through candidates that he personally picked, like here in Georgia, a former running back, which is a very important position in American football, Herschel Walker, who has major mental health issues, who has a very problematic past of violence and abortions or whatever, but who Trump has known for decades. And Trump just asked him run. He asked another person to run against our governor, who he hates, even though he's a Republican. And many of these candidates that he picked or that he supported were seen by the Republican leadership as problematic, not necessarily for their ideas, but because of their lack of experience, because of the mistakes that they make. So Trump is strong enough to push these people through primaries, but he's not strong enough to push them through the elections. And as a consequence, many of these candidates did about 3-4% less than other Republicans in the state. And in certain cases, this lost them seats that they could have won. And so at the moment, the discourse is Trump is a liability. Now, where Trump is seen as the big loser of the election, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is seen as the big winner. Now, DeSantis is the only Republican today that could potentially challenge Trump for the 2024 elections. And Trump is very aware of that. And so DeSantis has been called the new king because he took Florida as governor very strongly. The thing is, though, that DeSantis only did 2% better than Marco Rubio did for his Senate race, which means that his personal bonus is actually fairly minimal. And that the shift has much more to do probably with, on the one hand, a very fast shifting population. Florida is very different from other states in that respect. They also have a very conservative Hispanic population. traditionally not just Cuban American, but also a lot of Venezuelan and other kind of rich Latin Americans who come up who tend to vote Republican. So the point is that DeSantis also was responsible for significant voter intimidation, creating an alleged election police, which then went after particularly some ex-convicts who now have the right to vote again, but he had them arrested in a very big media kind of stunt. Now, most of the people that were arrested were later cleared in court, but it sends a very chilling effect to some of the most marginalized people. And of course, most of the ex-convicts are minorities. And if you're an ex-convict, you already have not too much to expect from the major parties. Why would you take the risk to vote if you could potentially end up back in jail, right? And I think that was what this action was all about. So it's not voter suppression in the technical sense of making it impossible for them to vote. It's voter intimidation. And so what some studies show is that Democratic turnout in Florida was much lower than in other states. That all being said, DeSantis is now seen as kind of the best option by the Republican leadership, as well as seems Fox News, which is not unimportant here. What he has, DeSantis is the governor of the fourth biggest state in terms of economy, one of the biggest states in population. So he has political experience. He is a culture warrior who in his victory speech said Florida is where woke goes to die. He is really all about woke. He has attacked Disney for being woke. He has gone after the University of Florida for being a woke institution. And so he has a very good profile of someone who gets stuff done. And I think the shift from Trump to DeSantis is something that we see in Europe as well. And it is a shift from kind of the outsider shouting from the outside in far-right politician to the politician who works within the political system. And think about Italy, where you saw this massive shift within the far right from Matteo Salvini, a classic example of someone who shouts a lot of stunts, but doesn't get much done, to Giorgia Meloni, who had a much more laid back kind of profile and who said that she was going to work from within the system. You see that here as well. To a certain extent, what Trump has achieved is he has brought the far right into the heart of the party. The base was already radical, right? But the leadership was largely still, let's say, conservative. The leadership is now bought into the radical right. And so Trump is kind of no longer necessary. And now they want someone who can achieve that agenda from within. The question now is, how do you deal with Trump? Trump clearly is so polarizing that he's a liability in the 2024 elections. Trump is also the only I would say the only politician in the US and perhaps the Western world who cannot be controlled. And he has, of course, a massive ego as well as massive legal problems. And the reason why he is almost certainly going to run in 2024 is at the very least to have leverage in his legal cases, if not to get above legality by being president. Should he win, the Republican Party has a problem because there is a part of the electorate that will not vote for him. Should he lose, the Republican Party has a problem because Trump cannot play second fiddle and will go after DeSantis, right? And so while Trump is the big loser, he is still in charge of the fate of the Republican Party, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cas, for this very comprehensive and suggestive analysis, opening, well, many avenues for all kinds of questions we will ask you afterwards. We now turn to Gérard for well, revisiting the same issue, of course, but in a different perspective.
Good morning from New York. And of course, I can't add, really a lot of things to what Cas just said. I agree with every word of his presentation. So maybe I'm going to try not to repeat what he said. So for me, there are four really main conclusions from an election. As he has said, really is not, we don't know the final results. And it would take some days for the House and maybe some weeks, certainly some weeks for the Senate to know what is the majority. First, no red wave, no Republican wave. I was on the phone, I think, in May or June with some Democrats, some members of the House, Democrats, and at the time they were telling me that they believe there could be a rout. They had been elected by 10 points, and actually they were not sure to be re-elected. A few weeks later, things had dramatically changed, and the explanation was twofold, and it was the 2 points emphasized by Cas. The first one was abortion. They were facing a mobilization of young women who usually don't vote so much for the midterm elections. Usually the rate of participation to the midterm elections is pretty low. And the second point was also that some of the Republican candidates were loonies. Frankly, that Trump had pushed forward some candidates who frankly didn't make a lot of sense. There were doubts in September about the fact that this anger of the women, especially of the women and the youth, would translate into a vote. There were this hovering question of inflation, which was there, but I think eventually we can conclude that inflation didn't have the influence that we were expecting. An inflation at 9%, it's something quite significant, and that actually there was mobilization around the question of abortion. The second point that, of course, failure of Trump and the DeSantis, now the DeSantis question. And the question mark is obviously whether DeSantis is going to run, because I'm sure that today all the conservative friends, the conservative leadership of the Republican Party is pushing him to run, but it will be quite a challenge. Challenging Donald Trump in an election again and again in primaries, and as Cas has explained, primaries which really are basically made by either Republican militants or really Republican registered, or in any way by people who are quite to the right of the general electorate, because the organization depends on the state, could be quite difficult because Trump is a brute. Trump is really doesn't cave in, really, and is able to all the most aggressive arguments that you can find. Don't forget that he was accusing the father of Cruz, the senator of Texas, to have taken part in the assassination of Kennedy. And again, he can rely on the enthusiastic support of some militants. I went to one or two major political meetings of Donald Trump, and it's something which is quite striking because, for people like us, what he says basically doesn't make any sense. It is totally a sort of erratic, really accumulation of sentences, but there is no real narrative. And nevertheless, around you have thousands, dozens of thousands of people who are enthusiastic. He knows how to speak to their guts. And every 30 minutes or 45 minutes in the meetings, because his speeches are lasting 1 hour, 2 hours, you have people starting to shout, "We love you, we love you, we love you." And and when leaving the meeting, and as I was a foreigner and Americans are nice people, I was discussing the what was happening, and none of the people I met was really basically arguing about the issues, or the policy. They were arguing about the fact of love, a sort of affective link that they had with this guy. So again, I think Trump is defeated, but he's so vindictive, so brutal, and he has a strong following in the party. So for DeSantis, I think it would be quite a challenge. And as Cas has said, there will be blood on the wall in the Republican Party in the coming 2 years. But there is a question that actually Cas has not touched, which is on the Democratic side. And of course, it's the candidacy of Joe Biden. The election was a pretty good election. Actually, it's the best election for the incumbent administration, with the exception of 2002 in the last 50 years. So now Biden, nobody is going to push Biden out. It's true that 70% of the Americans don't want Biden to run in 2024. Let's be very frank, Biden is aging, and as you know, all of you, it shows, really, and the Americans need a commander-in-chief, and frankly, this granddad is not the commander-in-chief they are dreaming of. But at the same time, if he said, really, I'm not going to run, it will be a lame duck, it will be a living dead. And so you can understand that he didn't do it. But by repeating, actually, that he was going to run, at the same time, he has sterilized the Democratic camp, because it means that no Democrat could run or could announce that he wanted to run. And you have to realize that actually the primaries actually are in less than 15 months. Really, we have now, the primaries are January, the first one, I think, the Iowa one will be in January 2024. So it's 13 or 12 months, 13, 14 months. So it means that the time for a Democratic candidate to prepare his candidacy, and you know that in America, preparing a candidacy is quite something, but also to be known by the Americans is really quite short. So a lot of my French friends said, oh, there will be Kamala Harris. The problem, and again, I've still problems to understand, but there is a general consensus among all the people I know in the Democratic Party to say that she's very bad, she is a failure, and we don't want her. So Joe Biden has announced that he will take his final decision in the coming weeks or months. So really, there is two scenarios. He is running, and frankly, I think that he was partly elected in 2020 because there was no electoral campaign in 2020, and he could run from his basement. Really, I don't know what it will be. But if he doesn't run, there is another question to the Democrats, because if you have two potential candidates on the Republican side, there is a blank on the Democratic side, and the Americans are not a political people the way the French are, for instance, and they ignore largely the federal politics. So to have a name recognized throughout America, really, it's quite difficult. It takes some time. So again, I think on the Democratic side, there is a big question mark on 2024. Foreign policy now, of course, like in any democracy, foreign policy was not a major element, hardly a minor element actually in the campaign. But there was vaguely an issue, which is Ukraine, and there will be, I think, an issue if, as it's likely, the Republicans take the House. Ukraine, for a lot of different reasons, because, first, a lot of people forget that Ukraine has played a major role for the first impeachment of Trump. which means that Trump, for some Trumpian reason, because the person is totally, as Cas has said, totally uncontrollable. He hates Ukraine. Personally, he hates Ukraine. He hates Zelensky. So that's the first reason. The second one, he believes that his personal relationship with Putin, really would be a good way of solving the issue. And there is also this idea that one of these crazy far-right House members, Marjorie Taylor Greene, said not a penny. Actually, she used the expression "not a penny to Ukraine," and not a penny to Ukraine because we need to build the wall on the border, and America first. Really America first. So Ukraine, I think, will be an interesting issue in a sense as a test of the balance of power within the Republican Party. Because on one side, you have the Trumpists, the most radical members of the group, and on the other side, you have the traditional conservatives who are also more or less anti-Russia. So what will be the balance of power? In a sense, whether the most radical Republicans will impose their agenda on the conservatives, as they often do, by the way. Really, that's also a question, going back to what Cas said about the right, the traditional right, is very often you have the impression that actually it's the far right who is imposing its agenda, even if the far right actually is, of course, maybe even a minority in the group. And the fact that Kevin McCarthy would be the Speaker of the House if the Republicans take the House, and he is a sort of traditional conservative, but he felt obliged to say, before the election, that actually they will have a say on the support to Ukraine, and it was it was a clear indication because it was not at the center of the election, and if he felt obliged to say it, to bring it to the fore, it means that actually it will be a test of where is the Republican Party. So, and for the Europeans, last point, but that's very hypothetical point is, of course, what will be at stake will be, in a sense, the future of the American right, and having a Trump or DeSantis could be quite different for us. Really, we know it, or the position of Trump towards NATO. If he is elected, he will feel totally free to do whatever he wants. He will think that he knows the job. He will express his hatred or contempt towards the traditional conservatives. And so I think that the question of even the future of the survival of NATO will be certainly at stake, but here it's very hypothetical. As for Ron DeSantis, let's not dream. Ron DeSantis, I think I joked on Twitter, Ron DeSantis is in a sense a Trump with a human face, a visage humain, un Trump à visage humain. Really, as Cas has said, he has really waged the most petty cultural battles. He's totally on this woke issue, and he is I think the difference with Trump is that he's controlling himself, that he's doing what he does not out of his guts but from his brains. He's a very good calculator, a very good strategist, and he doesn't have any scruples. So I will finish on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gérard, for covering both domestic as well as international politics. And both of you, even if the elections are not over yet, in fact, could enlighten us and draw some conclusions already, converging rather than diverging. In fact, you were very complimentary, and you raised several questions we may return to now. We have plenty of time for the Q&A, and Mark has joined us, and we'll.
I'm sorry for the delay. I'm sorry.
No, this is not the problem.
As you see, there are 3 questions, Christophe.
Yes, there are questions. I suggest that we begin with the domestic politics, and in order to clarify somewhat the debate, and then shift to the foreign policy dimension. So in domestic politics, we have already a question. I would like to just initiate the conversation by asking a question about the well, Republicans who are still moderate, if any. How are they looking at the rise of DeSantis? Is it an antidote to Trump they are happy with, or do we still see, or can we still anticipate tensions within the Republican Party between those who are certainly conservative, but not necessarily as radical as DeSantis? Because as Gérard said, it's a Trump with a human face, and that may be one of the reasons why on the Republican Party there may be some issue. And the other question to Cas, because he has not indeed dealt with this issue, is on the Democratic Party side, who can be there in 2024?
May I add just a question, Christophe, for Gérard and for Cas, about the first question. I've been very interested, Cas, and really I'm sorry because I missed the beginning of what you say, but you did a distinction, I think very exciting, and especially, as you know, because I'm interested mainly by Italian case, between this radical populism or radical attitudes against system from one side, and what you say more or less this radicalism inside the system, which is a very interesting distinction, with some extension precisely to other countries. But in your opinion, what do they are expecting for the Republican voters, not only the members of the party, but the Republican voters? Are they waiting for a more radical against system, or a radicalism inside the political system, to use your very exciting distinction?
Great. So maybe you could, Cas, and then Gérard, respond to this first round of questions, and then we'll open the floor for those who are already asking questions in the Q&A box. And please do add questions in the box. Cas.
Yeah, okay, so thanks for that question. I think that I want to revisit a point that Gérard made, which I think is very important, like how when you go to a Trump rally, right, they will shout, "I love you." And so Trump is, as all politicians, like overrated as a charismatic leader and the cult of personality, et cetera, et cetera. It's overrated in the sense that the vast majority of people who vote for Trump have no specific relationship to Trump. They don't see him as the person to save. He's not a charismatic in the Bavarian sense, but there is a small group of Republican voters for which this is the case, and they have an emotional tie. And in two ways. On the one hand, there's a part that loves him because he is a very good example, actually, of the myth of the American dream. So the myth of the American dream is that you pull yourself by the bootstraps and then you become rich. And of course, the reality of the American dream is that most of the super rich people come from super rich parents, right? And Trump is very much that case. But social envy is not as big in the US as it is in Europe. And so the fact that you're rich is to a certain extent within the Republican Party has always been something positive, and is not seen as, oh, you must be corrupt. No, you must be very hardworking or smart, whatever. But what Trump is also very good at is making his own genuinely felt frustrations towards the elite, right? Because he has always been marginalized by the traditional elite of New York, for whom he isn't good enough, right? And because he is so authentic, like, it resonates with the people. And they see their own, like what they perceive as their own marginalization reflected in that. And so there is a part of the electorate that truly connects at a personal level to Trump. DeSantis doesn't have this at all. Like, I actually think DeSantis has the charisma of a wet towel. He is just he's a politician in everything. He shows he's a politician. His whole body, the way he speaks, he doesn't captivate. And that's an important difference, because that means that there is a part of the electorate that he will not reach. And the margins in the US are small, right? Now, in terms of where the difference is, it's not in ideology, right? It's purely in strategy. DeSantis is not less radical than Trump. He's more predictable, which is worth something when you're the president of the United States, right? I mean, if you're the prime minister of Luxembourg, it doesn't matter that much. But if you're the president of the United States, the biggest military power in the world, predictability is pretty important. And DeSantis is that. DeSantis is also manageable, right? And so this is why the Republican elite likes him. The Republican elite never liked Trump. Like much of the electorate, the problem wasn't with his policies. In fact, they love his policies. Like, so it's not with the radical right, it's not with nativism, authoritarianism, those type of things. It is with his delivery and his personality. And to a certain extent, DeSantis does exactly the same, but being more predictable, playing within the relative rules of the game. And to me, this is very similar to Meloni versus Salvini. Even though Salvini is much more of a politician than Trump, Salvini is the showish type who just lives for himself in his social media presence, is not interested really in legislating, is more for the extra parliamentary show. Meloni, being influenced by PIS, like Law and Justice in Poland, as well as by Orban, is what Princeton professor Kim-Lane Shapler calls democratic erosion by law. And very importantly, Rick DeSantis is a lawyer, as is Orban, as are many others who are destroying liberal democracy by law. And so what you see that DeSantis is doing is he's weakening, if not undermining, liberal democracy, but largely by following the law. And as a consequence, he's much more effective. Because the fact of the matter is, Trump was very ineffective in his presidency. The only things that he got done were the things that were already supported by the Republican Party, which is lower taxes, deregulation, defunding of the state. Right? The only thing, maybe the tariffs towards China, and even that has, like, the anti-China mood within the Republican Party predates Trump and goes very broadly. Most of the things with regard to judges, with regard to the wall, like, didn't actually do that much. DeSantis will be much more effective, and that is kind of what they hope to get out of him. I think that's also what a large portion of the traditional Republican electorate wants, right? And this is, again, in part because Trump did all the breaking. Like, the one thing that is very hard to understand, but why Trump was loved by a lot of right-wing people here, was because what they call in the US, he owned the libs. There is a collective inferiority complex on the right here. This idea that they have been bullied by the left for very long. And Trump just stood up to that and had no shame, like, had no inferiority complex. But nowadays, that all the new radical right politicians in the Republican Party are like that. And so DeSantis is a product of Trump. Right? It is because that Trump broke down the elite of the Republican Party, as well as much of the media, that someone like DeSantis can come in. And I think that's important. So the Democratic Party, in part, I don't touch on it because it's a depressing story. As Gérard said, like, I actually watch almost no television. And just before the midterms, I actually saw a short clip of Biden walking to his helicopter. And I was shocked how old he looked. He looks 10 years older than Trump. He looks frail. His speaking is uninspiring. And Biden came to power because he was the only one who could beat Trump, right? And that hasn't changed. He hasn't become more popular. My point is, I think he's going to hang in there. Not even so much of ego. It's very hard for politicians to step back. I honestly think there is no successor. Kamala Harris was not popular before in her primary. Pretty much has been killed by Biden in the first months of his presidency because he sent her to Central America to take a pretty staunch anti-immigration position, which she won't be forgiven by a large part of the electorate. There is no clear face. And one of the things that this is a humongous country with a very little informed audience. Like someone like Gavin Newsom, who is one of the frontrunners potentially, who is the governor of California. If you ask your average Georgian here, there will not even be 10% who know who Newsom is. Like what made Trump unique was that Trump's name recognition was higher than virtually any politician because he was a TV star. Most politicians, even DeSantis, right? About half of Americans do not know who DeSantis is. So to do that within 1 year, right, to get that type of name recognition is insanely difficult. And so I feel that the Democratic Party is stuck with Biden. And that is a massive risk because his health is clearly not impressive. And he can easily have a stroke or things like that. And then the Democrats are in power, but are in trouble. But if they would go to a primary, I think they're in an even bigger problem. So it's ironic. Both Trump and Biden are to a certain extent the best that the parties have, and they're also the biggest liability of these parties.
Thank you, Cas, and thank you for taking the risk of prognosis and scenarios. That's exactly what we expect from you. Gérard.
Of course, again, I agree 100% with what just Cas said. I remember during the campaign of 2016, actually, the campaign for the election of Donald Trump, one of the diplomats at the embassy told me something which was striking. He said, the Republicans, they said, make America great again. You can consider that it's very primitive, but at the same time, it's a global message. It's a message that you are sending to all Americans, whatever their race, their social, their sexual orientation. While obviously, when you were looking at the Democratic campaign, basically they were saying in a very targeted way, Willie, you are Black, so you should vote Democrat. You are gay, you should vote Willie. And that was, I think, something. It's something, Willie. Between a party which, in a sense, you are not able to say what is the national message of the Democrats. What do they want for the country? That was the first point. Second point, one day I met at friend's place workers and contractors who were renovating his house, and again we had a conversation, and most of them, all of them, had voted for Trump. And actually, most of them said that before they had voted for Obama. And I tried to explain why. And they told me, they say, oh, Trump is giving a middle finger to the New York Times. And in a sense, this sort of anti-elitist feeling that is expressing Trump, in a sense like Boris Johnson, which is paradoxical because they come from the elite themselves. So they are reassuring in a sense. They are serious. They are billionaires. They are able to to quote a Greek poetry in Greek. So, but at the same time, they are different. They have shown that actually they are able to bully these elites, which are so despised by a part of the population. And frankly, it's going beyond the idea of right or left. And that's why also Cas is pretty right by saying what I didn't think of. The fact is that DeSantis, whatever he tries to do, is identified with the traditional elites. He went to Harvard, I guess, and so he is not very credible with an anti-elitist message.
Thank
Can
you.
I just?
Yeah, please, Gas.
So one of the things that is often not understood outside of the US is that actually Obama was also to a large extent a protest vote. Obama had only been in national politics for 2 years. He was the outsider while he had a much more intellectual, particularly by US standards, like profile. And he didn't have a populist campaign. He was very much an outsider, right? And that made him very attractive. And that is totally forgotten because then you got like the Tea Party and the whole populist wave. And now we look back at Obama as this kind of professor, like who was this model how politicians should be. But actually, like his campaign was very much an outsider campaign. And so from that perspective, from a racial perspective, racist perspective, right? The Obama-Trump vote move seems bizarre, but it's a little bit, in that sense, like the Liberal Democratic Party functions often in the UK. Like you actually have people who go from the Liberal Democratic Party to UKIP, which you think like, how is that possible? From the most pro-EU party to the most anti-EU party, from a serious party to like this outsider party. But the Lib Dems also have for part of the electorate this kind of outsider, not one of the two. And so I think that's important to remember that Obama was this kind of not insider Democratic Party.
Thank you. There is one question in the chat box on the independence, and I think it would be interesting to do justice important to do justice to this question, especially because we have at least one place, I think your place, Cas, where an independent is probably going to decide in which way will the assembly go. What kind of role do independents play in elections like these ones?
There's two levels of independence. On the one hand, independent voters, and then the other hand, independent candidates. So independent voters are portrayed in the media as people who can move from Republican to Democrat. In reality, that's not really the case. Almost all independents are either leaning Republican or leaning Democrat. And over the last decades, the vast majority is actually leaning Republican, but tend to be more conservative than the Republican. Independent candidates tend to be, there's only one party that has candidates, third-party candidates in most states, which is the Libertarian Party. Traditionally, the Libertarian Party was the pro-marijuana party in a sense. So it's libertarian on social economics and on social cultural. And on social cultural, the issue that they tend to like bring up is drug policy. The Libertarian Party, as libertarianism in general, has moved significantly to the right. And so quite a lot of the people who run for the Libertarian Party are pretty racist. Despite being libertarian, they are very much in favor of very strong borders. At times with very strong abortion positions as well, as Ron Paul had, for example. The thing is that the interesting thing about Georgia is that an independent ran both in the governor race, like a libertarian ran both in the governor race and in the Senate race. In the governor race, they got less than 1%, if I remember correctly, 0.6%. In the race for the Senate, they got 2%. And that brought the election to a runoff, right? Because in the Georgia, you need 50%. I don't think his electorate is actually relevant. What decides runoffs is who comes out. And what I expect based on what we've seen before, but our governor, Brian Kemp, is very popular. Herschel Walker is not popular. Herschel Walker profited from the fact that Republicans were coming to vote anyway for Brian Kemp and then vote down ballot, right? Warnock is popular among Democrats, has a very good machine because the African-American community in Georgia, which is 1/3 of the population, but has a very strong middle class in Atlanta, is very well organized. And so I think what actually decides the runoff is not this 2% of independents who allegedly lean Warnock anyway, so Democrat anyway in this case. It is who comes out. And I do believe that will be Democrats. At the same time, as the runoff was in 2020, this is a national election, right? The runoff in Georgia is probably going to decide who is going to control the Senate. And so the amount of money that's going to pour into Georgia again is going to be insane. I still think that Warnock will pull it off. And so to make it simple, independents, as far as they exist, tend to be spoilers. What they can at best achieve is create runoffs in states where candidates need 50%, which is not the case everywhere.
Thank you. Very interesting. And we'll be waiting for this election, of course, in the coming weeks that will decide the fate of the Senate. The next question is for Gérard, because we are moving to the list of questions in their order. And we have two questions on China by Balvir and Alberto on this, China factor in US foreign policy. The question is, of course, what role does it play? But Alberto asked, what difference would that make if Trump or DeSantis were becoming president in that respect?
When I was in Washington, I think it was in October 2018, Vice President Pence made a very, very anti-Chinese speech at the Hudson Institute, which was very impressive. And afterwards, I met most of the experts on China in Washington, D.C., Republicans or Democrats, and there was a total consensus. I think there is maybe one issue in American politics now. It's a consensus of a global confrontation between the U.S. and China. And I think that if DeSantis was elected, it wouldn't make a lot of difference. If Trump is elected, he will bring all his erratic intuitions really into the fray. But nevertheless, there will be a global confrontation. And a lot of people, I think in France at least, didn't notice, or I'm sure that the Institut Montaigne, you did it, but a speech by on 16th of September, when he was setting really all the elements of the war, of the economic, technological war that the US administration has decided to wage against China. And we had on October the 7th, this incredible decision to totally decouple the China and the US in the field of advanced chips. And when you look at the measures, practical measures which are behind it, it's incredible. It's quite advanced. It's quite drastic. Really, even somebody who is not American but with a green card should immediately leave his job if his job has any relationship with providing advanced chips to China. It's a deliberate attempt to prevent China from becoming an advanced economy or delaying really the China from becoming an advanced economy. And really the reaction in the US, I can tell you, was really very mute, and there were simply approvals or even people saying, oh, it doesn't go far enough. So on China, I think that's the bilateral relationships which will define international relations for the coming decades. And the US is, in a very systematic way, don't forget that the US is a security country. They have 17 intelligence services, 17. So the US are preparing or setting the basis for this global confrontation. So I don't think that Democrats, Republicans, but again, with the caveat about the Trump erratic behavior, I don't think it would make a lot of difference.
Very interesting. Thank you, Gérard. Cas raised his hand on this, I suppose.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I fully agree about the bipartisanship of the China policy. And if like it was under the radar, but actually Biden was running with a very strong anti-China message in 2020. I just wanted to abuse the situation to get an insight from Gérard on this. So it's very clear the US is obsessed with China. I was just at West Point for a conference, which is the military academy. And there is this actually the cadets and whatever were relatively moderate, but everyone was absolutely certain that it was terrible for the world if like the US would no longer be the leader and China would be, right? But what we also see is that there is increasing pressure from the US on Europe to take a position in this, right? And of course, take a pro-US position. At the same time, the US has a very specific agenda on China, which is mostly about its own hegemony rather than just human rights and other issues. Do you think that this is going to be one of the major tensions and challenges in transatlantic relations going forward?
Yeah, good. In the context of Scholz's visit to China last week.
You know, I do agree. It's a major issue, I think, for us Europeans. The Americans are going to ask us to choose our camp. It's obvious. And the fact also is that it will be done in the context of the war with Ukraine, which means that a lot of European countries which don't have any interest, to be frank, in Asia, or any history or any interest in Asia, are going to say, look at the way the Americans are supporting us in Ukraine, let's support them in China, especially with this autocracy versus democracy narrative. And the question, really the question which would be raised, what will be the reaction of the Europeans? And frankly, personally, I hope that the Europeans will not gang with the Americans. Of course, we are closer to the Americans than to the Chinese, but the issues are very different from the Cold War. And in a sense, the geography is also very, very different. Usually I argue, I say, don't forget that most of the Asian countries don't want to choose their camp. Actually, it would be strange if we did, while countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, of course, they are worried by China, about what China is doing, but they don't want to choose their camp. There won't be a bamboo curtain falling on Asia. And so why the Europeans we will join Australia? I can understand Australia, but that's not our interest and vision of the world. But you're perfectly right. It will be a tough debate in the coming months on Europe. And I think that one of the angles of this debate will be through the transfer of technology to China. You remember, because we are the generation which still can remember, there was the COCOM at the happy times of the USSR, which was, really monitoring and preventing the export of some technology to the USSR. So I'm wondering whether the Americans are not going to try to get the same thing from Europeans versus China. But that would be a major issue in the coming months.
Yeah, and that will make Indo-Pacific policies more diverging than converging, possibly. That's another topic, but we'll have to deal with this one for sure. Let's return to domestic politics and take Michel Duclos' question on the role of the economy in the campaign as well as religion, because that's something you've not touched upon so much till now. And we know that evangelicals and others play a role. So how do you factor in these two variables? Cas, would you start? Or?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So there's been a debate, partly because of Bernie Sanders, partly because of the liberal media, which for some reason just always likes to divide the Democratic Party, which really took off in the last couple of weeks before the midterms, which was like, did the Democratic Party talk too little about the economy? And I took a position on that in a panel for The Guardian, and I was the only one who argued no, which is in part because almost all the other people are from the Bernie Sanders camp. And this has a lot to do with this idea, which is still dividing the left, like is whether social cultural issues to a certain extent, like whether these are distractions from, for the sake of argument, like the class struggle. So the point, the fact of the matter, as we have seen, is that abortion was the savior of the Democratic Party. It was because of abortion that a sizable portion of new voters came out. And the problem with economy is that all the indicators, all polls show that the majority of Americans trust the Republican Party on the economy rather than the Democratic Party. The vast majority of the Americans think that the Biden administration has been very weak on the economy. And so if you make the economy big, there is a fair chance that it will make people think, okay, so then I should vote for that. Now, to be fair, there are very few Americans left who actually move from one party to the other, right? Elections are decided about who comes out rather than on shifting voters. So I think the economy is a major problem for the Democratic Party, because it's just not going well, and most of that is out of reach of the party. Like when you have a global recession, when you have an energy crisis, potentially a food crisis, there's only so much you can do as a government, and you can mitigate it, but that is not something that you get rewarded for, right? By saying, look, sure, it is not good at the moment, but it could be worse, right? And so they have to speak about it. I think there was a very good turnout of Gen Z generation. I think this has a lot to do with the Biden administration's decision to alleviate college debt, right? And so there are aspects of it, but in the end, the economy is a very difficult issue. Now, religion is just insanely complex. So there is a study from a Notre Dame colleague, David Campbell, as well as Robert Putnam, the famous political sociologist. It's called American Grace, and it shows how the religion is changing in the US. And it's changing because increasingly organized religion has become so closely tied to the Republican Party. This is the case mostly for the white evangelicals. There are a lot of non-white evangelicals, although even Hispanic evangelicals probably are pretty close to the Republican Party. There is a kind of a radicalization in the Catholic part of the population, particularly the ones that are observant. But at the same time, this has led to a growth of the so-called secular population. Now, seculars in the US are not atheists. These are actually religious people who don't identify with organized religion. And this is particularly younger and higher educated people, and of course, more liberal people. And it's a direct consequence of the incredibly close relationship between most outspoken churches and the Republican Party. Now, religion plays a role to a certain extent, but what people tend to forget is that the Democratic Party is also, in a sense, a party of religious voters, like, because the vast majority of Americans are religious. Most Democratic politicians talk about their faith. And just think about Georgia. Like, I mean, here in Georgia, we have a reverend running for the Democratic Party, the reverend who teaches or who preaches, like in the church of Martin Luther King, right? Has studied theology. And yet, the vast majority of white evangelicals vote for Herschel Walker, who barely knows what the Bible is and has paid off like 2 girlfriends to have abortion. So religion is, on the one hand, Americans do go to church, but it's also deeply political these days. And so religion, I don't think adds that much, in part because both camps are religious, and in part because it is not about being Christian or not. It's about where you stand on other issues. And again, there have been quite a lot of religious people who voted because of Roe v. Wade, who are actually against abortion, but also don't believe that the state should intervene in this, right? And so religion as such, I think, is more important in terms of the role that institutionalized religion plays. And it is very clear that white evangelical movement is very much pushing the Republican Party. And as this link, as we see in Latin America with Bolsonaro, for example, it is a highly problematic link because the white evangelical movement is also radicalizing.
Yes, Gérard.
I think tit for tat, I'm going to ask a question to Cas about the Hispanics. Because, you know, really, a lot of people believe, and I think I share this belief, that a lot of Hispanics could actually vote Republicans because they are conservative in their life and for some other reasons. The fact is that because of the immigration issue, so far, they have really, first, they vote less than the majority, the rest of the population, but usually they vote more for the Democrats. And there have been a lot of really talking about the Hispanics shifting slowly towards the Republicans, which could be actually a major issue for the future elections.
Yes, it's a very good point. So at this time, we don't have good data. I saw an exit poll, but exit polls in the US are very problematic. But anyway, I saw an exit poll that showed that here in Georgia, 55% of Hispanics had voted for Stacey Abrams, the Democratic candidate, 45% for Kemp. That is disastrous for the Democratic Party, but it also makes perfect sense, actually. So Kemp ran on, which is very hard probably to understand for Europeans, but he actually ran on his COVID policy. And his COVID policy was pretty much not denying COVID like Bolsonaro did or Trump did to a certain extent, but just by not saying the economy is more important. And so we never had a lockdown. My university didn't even have a vaccine mandate or a mask mandate. That was not allowed by the Kemp administration. But what Kemp said, because of my policies, the economy of Georgia is doing really strong. Now you have to remember that most Hispanics work in very precarious positions, which means that if you have a lockdown, they have no income, right? And there is no real welfare state in the US. And so for them, the economy is directly about whether or not they eat, right? And this is an argument that, for example, in the south of Texas in 2020, there was a lot of Hispanic vote for Trump. And it was a similar argument where people said, look, the Republicans kept this open. I think I agree. I think in that sense, the Hispanic population is very similar to the Turkish population in Germany or in the Netherlands and Belgium. It is a conservative, more religious population, which is also very much invested in small business. And so traditionally, this kind of center-right thing. Now, of course, what makes it so remarkable here is that the Republican Party is also the most nativist party towards Hispanics, because that is like immigration. When you say immigration in the US, you speak about Central Americans, Mexicans and Central Americans. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that what you yourself said earlier, the Democratic Party doesn't have a national message. It addresses every single group on the basis of identity politics. But yes, African Americans have issues as African Americans. Hispanics have issues as Hispanics, but they also have economic interests. And in that sense, Republican Party addresses Hispanic populations from the perspective of economics. And the Democrats don't. And I think that plays a role. But I also believe that it is a bit of a generational issue. I think that the young Hispanics who are, first of all, better educated than the older ones, who are socialized during the Trump years, during these years, are going to come out less to the Republican Party because they will associate the Republican Party with deep nativism. First generation, which is mostly green card, then will be different. And there's a last point, which is the Hispanic population. There are two populations: the Central American one, which probably still disproportionately votes Democratic, and the South American one. The South American one is not just like Cuba, but it's also Venezuela. There's a sizable portion of Venezuelans that moved over the last decade into the US, mostly incidentally to Florida. Argentinians, Bolivians, but it is a very specific part of them. It is the richer part that goes, and anti-communism is a major issue for them. And this is what the Republican Party really campaigns on. And so what they try to do is say, woke is kind of Venezuela, right? And even though Maduro is anything but woke, right? And there is this idea of like the woke is really like what is destroying the continent in the South, the same communist movement. And if there's anything that I see from elections, in particularly Florida and Georgia, it is that the Hispanic vote is a major problem for Democratic strategists and has been heavily underestimated. Asian American votes, incidentally, as well. Like, I mean, first of all, as Christophe will know, the Indian American population, which is growing and significant in certain parts, is deeply conservative. And there's a strong link to the Hindutva movement, Modi. But Chinese Americans are also not necessarily the most progressive. And so it's really just African Americans. Like, I mean, African Americans vote in the 90% for the Democrats. But it's not just a minority vote. Both Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans are increasingly in the 60-40 range, which is going forward a problem.
Yes, and we see these diasporas now divided along religious lines as well. And you have the Hindu vote for the Republicans and the Muslim vote for the Democrats. The same way in UK, we see the Tories getting the Hindu vote and the Labour Party getting the Muslim vote. So it becomes very complicated to look at community votes, but very important and very interesting for sure. We have one last question in the chat box, asking about the role played by past events in the campaign. Of course, the fact that the election of 2020 was contested, the Capitol riots. This is Vineet from India precisely, who is asking how did that play out, and also if you can update us on what about the judicial pursuits. What could be the implications of the judicial process that is still going on for sure vis-a-vis Trump and his colleagues?
Maybe if I can start with that. So the judicial situation is highly, highly problematic for Trump, and allegedly one of the main reasons why he wants to declare to run for president. So the fact that the right-wing media is partly turning against Trump is of major concern to him, because there are court cases. I mean, we have the January 6th investigation, but there are actually two potentially more threatening court cases. There's more of a civil case in New York, which has to do with fraud, which obviously is it cannot be controlled by the Republican Party in any way. And then there's a fundamental court case about manipulation of elections here in Georgia. And so Trump is in serious. Oh, and then there's the court case about the papers that they found in Mar-a-Lago, right? And so Trump is really in a very, very dire situation and needs support of the Republicans in this. At the same time, if he runs for presidency, he can say that this is a political investigation, and they do it for that and can rally support for him, as this is not against me, it's against the Republican Party. I'm not sure whether these cases go anywhere, and there's a lot of pushback within the Democratic elite, particularly, let's say, the more centrist, who are very afraid that this will lead to a backlash. But the midterms have been terrible for him in this respect, right? Because it seems now that Trump is vulnerable within the right, and so you can go ahead of that. More depressing than anything in American politics, I would say, over the last 2 years has been how the insurrection is a no issue for Republicans. So actually, there is virtually no Republican was running who speaks about the insurrection in negative terms. Anyone who spoke out against it was defeated in primaries or just decided not to run because they knew they would lose in the primaries, right? We have a person here, for example, who is the local gun shop owner in my town, who is on camera, like trying to fortify the House floor against the insurrectionists, and who now talks about the insurrectionists as tourists, as the equivalent of tourists. He just got reelected with 73%. Right? So the insurrection is just free speech. It's been redefined within the Republican Party as free speech. It's not a bad thing. In fact, if you don't support it, you stay silent on it. But there have been several candidates who have pretty much talked about, who have campaigned even with people who were at the Capitol and who got elected. Marjorie Taylor Greene, which Gérard mentioned, who is also from my state of Georgia, not only got reelected easily, despite the fact that 20 million was funded for her opponent. Marjorie Taylor Greene has been marginal in House over the last couple of years. She is going to be one of the more important players going forward. And so the election, whether it's stolen or not, the insurrection, all of these things are non-issues for Republicans. And the Democrats went on this way too late. And this has a lot to do with Biden. Biden is in many ways a political fossil. We have to remember that he first came into Congress in 1973. 73, that is an insanely long period ago. It is very hard for him to update to today's world. So when he thinks about Republican Party, he thinks about a conservative party with whom you can deal, which is being kind of captured by a small group of extremists, rather than what it is, a far-right party with a few conservatives at the top. And he got elected on a message of bipartisanship, which he has held out for a very long time. And then 2 weeks before the election, he says, well, democracy is at stake in the election. Yeah, you can't sell that in 2 weeks, right? And so that message kind of went nowhere. It plays a role through abortion to a certain extent, but it doesn't play as big a role as it should have.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left, even less than that. And I would like Gérard maybe to have the last word on any issue you would consider as important for the future.
I wanted to really, again, to answer to the same question, because, when I was following the impeachment, the first impeachment, I was struck at the time. I was convinced that it was a big mistake by the Democrats, because basically nobody could understand the issues, which were very complicated. And it appeared that, for the Trump supporters, that the elites really wanted, in a sense, to negate the result of the elections. And to be frank, I think it's partly true. I think that, and this aspect, I want to emphasize the aspect, the elites against the people. And I was struck, you know, I tried, when I was in Washington, to organize really a lot of meetings with the Democrats to ask them what are the lessons they were they were drawing from the defeat of Hillary Clinton. And I was totally surprised that most of the time they said basically she was a bad candidate and he's a crook. But again, there was, and still now, I think on the Democratic side, I don't feel a sort of really, let's look at what these people are telling us. They are not fascist, and how can address the concerns they are expressing. Because as we are right now, and it's, I think, my final message, we have a new right. And again, it's a new right not only in the US, but also in Europe, which is identity, you know, identity, protectionism, you know, really authority. And the question mark, and I remember I was in the US, I was always asking that, what will be the new left? You know, we have a new right. What is the new left? And I think that the question mark is still there, including including in France. Thank you.
No, thank you, Gérard, because this is exactly the kind of questions we are asking ourselves with Mark and others. This is, of course, an academic exercise to some extent, but policy-oriented as much as we can. So thank you very much for both of you having deciphered for us the results of these elections. We were probably more relieved in the beginning of the webinar than now, because gradually we somewhat lost the kind of optimism we felt looking at the results, but that's good. We need to know what is really unfolding itself in the US in the perspective of the 2024 elections. So thank you again. This
Thanks
will be uploaded on, and Mark will and myself will edit the transcript of this that will be made available, and the record, of course, the recorded version will be made available as well on the website of Institut Montaigne, and of course also of the illiberalism program of Marlène Laruelle, who was with us today. Thank you all, and have a good day in the US.
Bye-bye.
Good afternoon.
Thanks a lot.
And good night
Thank
in
you.
Asia. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.